So welcome everybody to our webinar. Today, Dr. Adams is going over the impact of adult children of sex addicts and how that he will be tying that into enmeshment, but the primary topic will be on the impact of being an adult child of a sex addict, and also we'll be going over his new book, A Light in the Dark, The Hidden Legacy of Adult Children of Sex Addicts. So I'll hand it over to you, Dr. Adams.
Thank you, Alexandra. Nice to see everybody. Some familiar faces. Hi. Well, this is both exciting and a little anxious to talk about this topic. And it's nice to know that I'm not alone as an adult child of a sex addict. So first things first, in the new book, along with my co-authors, Dr. Mary Meyer and Cully Vandegaard, when I first envisioned this book years ago, probably 20 years ago, I had a sense that if I was going to ask the reader to tell their story, that I had to tell mine. And I was not going to do it alone. So that's why the book took all this time, is that I had it in my head, at least the outline, but I was not going to be the only one telling my story and put it in a book. So my co-authors very bravely joined me. And so the first 3 chapters of the book are our personal stories. So I want to walk you through some basics around what it is that we pointed to in the book, what I've learned about the topic, and kind of get you going on the topic of sex addiction, primarily geared towards the recovering adult child as opposed to the therapist. So I know I have a lot of my therapist colleagues sitting in front of me here, but you'll do the adjustments and translate it to the clients as you need to, but I'm going to be speaking to the adult child here today. Okay. So just as a little background, you know, all fields of study, including the study of sex addiction, sort of reach a ceiling where the energy, the money, the research sort of hits a ceiling. We kind of know what we know about sex addiction. We know what we know about partner trauma. And certainly people are adding to that and they're tweaking it and they're finessing it, but there's not a lot. We're not learning much more. So naturally what happens in the field, the focus begins to shift on other parts of the experience. And we saw this in the treatment of alcoholism, where after a period of time where the alcoholic was being treated, they knew what they were doing. Pretty soon we began to look at the family. And out of that movement came the adult children of alcoholic movement, which was huge. And it was a big part of my personal early recovery, as well as my professional practice. So we patterned our adult child of sex addicted parents after that model. But basically, there's been little study. There's been some study looking at the impact of young children in sexually addicted families, but we've not really taken a look at what happens, what do the adults who grew up in these systems carry into their adult lives. So we don't really have a lot of data on that. So A Light in the Dark, The Hidden Legacy of Adult Children of Sex Addicts by myself and my co-authors really is the first published piece on that book. There was one article done by Mick Hunter years ago. There's been some attempts to do adult children about sex addict 12-step meetings, which are now going, not a lot, but some. Most of the time, this topic has been kind of wedged underneath other models. So in sex addiction, for example, there's a high percentage of sex addicts who are adult children. I gave this talk to a group of recovering sex addicts. Dr. Patrick Carnes invited me down to his leadership program. And I gave a talk to this group of men, recovering sex addicts, working their butts off to recover, to make amends, to get out of their shame. And a couple of the guys started crying when I presented this. And it hit them that they could never escape the shame in spite of their recovery. And they realized that shame wasn't all theirs. No matter how many amends they made for their personal behavior, it wasn't going to change the fact that they were carrying a sort of internalized shame that came from their sexually addicted parent and their sexually addicted family system. So these guys had this. So it was the kind of the tears you get in this sort of opening of awareness that we see when the recovery language and the narrative is accurate. Other times, oftentimes we've had the adult children topic wedged underneath the partner trauma model. There's an assumption, shorthanded, that, well, in the same way spouses are impacted, the children are impacted similarly. That's simply not true. The children are impacted similarly and differently. And when the adult child tries to look at their experience through the eyes of the injured partner, they lose their own ability to protest based on how they feel. So the partner trauma model too does not really help the adult children of sex addicts any more than the adult children of alcoholic model, or for that matter, other models as well. So we needed a new model. And the value, and they say this too, the whole purpose, in my experience, of recovery models in terms of watching other people heal and watching my own journey, is that there's something very powerful, is there not, when you say, oh my God, that's my story. That's my story. You live my life. That person sitting across the room in the support group, or that book I just read, you were living in my family. It's that moment when that happens that all possibility for healing opens up. And if that moment doesn't happen, there can still be good work, but I think the true shift cathartically, emotionally, and so forth doesn't happen until the right narrative occurs. So hence the book, right? Here's the copy. I love the cover, by the way. When they sent it to us, we took very short time agreeing on this. We came pretty quickly to the agreement, so we like that. So one of the tenets of so for example, coming back to this idea that the right narrative opens up the window. I mean, I'm sure that adult children of sex addicts have gotten a lot of help over the years from different models: internal family systems, developmental immaturity model, the partner trauma model, the sex addiction model, but none of them really light up that part of you that says, oh yeah, that's my story. Or even the adult children of alcoholics. I remember I used to sit in meetings as a recovering adult child of an alcoholic. I talk about everything but my father's affairs, right? There was a code of silence. And so what we're trying to do in this book is break that code of silence, right? It's time to talk about the stories, which is the first issue in treatment, is to break through the denial, acknowledge the system you grew up in, and start telling your story. And there's something very powerful when you're around other people telling the story, which is the amazing thing about recovery models. One of the difference in the adult children of sex addict model, I was asked this question yesterday in a podcast. What's the main difference between the adult children of sex addicts and the adult children of alcoholic model? And I said, sexual shame. Sexual shame is the link generationally that causes trauma. So inherent in our thesis in the book is this idea that you don't need to witness, you don't need to be the directly impacted by the trauma to be impacted one or two generations later. Children of Holocaust survivors, for example, are studied extensively on this matter. And you don't need to be a Holocaust survivor. One or two generations down from Holocaust survivors, you have children who are living in fear that they're going to die. They're vigilant that they're going to die, right? That generationally the trauma is being passed down. So those of you who are clinicians know all about this. Well, what we see in sexually addicted families is the shame is carried down. So if, for example, if we grow up in a family and dad or mom are having affairs, and in all the chaos and all the fighting and the betrayal and et cetera, we'll talk about what that system feels like in a minute. Those children grow up and become adults, and they have children too, for example, if they're oriented to do that and wanting to do that. But they carry with them this sense of vigilance, betrayal, hurt, anger, mistrust, and shame. And so when their children start to be curious sexually, they become vigilant and controlling and try to manage or overmanage a child's natural curiosity, and the kid's like, what did I just do? Right? Something must be wrong with my natural curiosity. So this child, a generation later, not witnessing the affairs, is now impacted by the sexual shame. So he or she now grows into their own sexuality, burdened with something's bad about my sexual curiosity. So now I'm either going to shut it down or I'm going to act it out. So now we produce another generation of sexually addicted family system survivors without witnessing directly the original offending behavior. You're with me on that? That's important here. And so that is the main difference in these system dynamics. And that's why, you know, having had great therapy over the years and sometimes average therapy myself, and always good, but sometimes better than others, if the right lens isn't viewed in your story, you don't have that aha moment. So if somebody doesn't say, oh, you must be an adult child of a sexually addicted parent, there isn't that immediate aha moment. I remember when I was first entered therapy in the therapy, I told my story, and the first question the therapist asked me, was your father, was anybody in your, was one of your parents an alcoholic? And I thought, how did she know, right? And there's something about being seen and having somebody get you that is very powerful. And that's our purpose here in helping you as an adult child or a therapist begin to see these adults through the lens that has been hidden and in secrecy and in shame over the years. So let's get on to the business of what these family systems look like. So the four characteristics of the first four was put out by a friend and colleague, Linda Hatch. Some of you may know her. She's in California. She did a nice job putting out a blog. So there's been a few attempts to talk about this, but not a lot. There are some people who work with children. I should make sure I mention that, but not particularly adult children. So the first thing she identified about sexually addicted family systems was the issue of secrecy and duplicity about sex. I said, that's right on, right? On one hand, we're very moralistic. Over here, though, we got a bunch of secrets going on, right? And so the kids get these dual contradictory messages about sexuality. In fact, we're not even going to talk about it, even though your father and mother are having affairs with the neighbor over here. Everybody knows, but we don't talk about sex because if we talk about sex, we're afraid it produces permissiveness, right? There's this whole belief system that if you do sex education or you talk about sex, it increases permissiveness, which is really an unfortunate dysfunctional belief that doesn't have a lot of merit. So in these family systems, there can be a rigid moralistic sexual attitude and then displays of hypervigilance and control around sexuality in reaction to the behavior that is escalating in one of the parents. Or the system can be very hypersexualized where there's no moral compass. You just do whatever you want to do. I don't answer to any higher power. And sexuality is at my whim, and I'll do with it what I want. So we do have permissive systems that look like nobody's minding the fort around the moral compass around sexuality. We tend to get more of folks having more of the reactive systems, but we see both. So again, these are contradictory values, a lot of shame and discomfort of leaving children ashamed of their own curiosity. So by the time they enter puberty, you know, they're already living in an environment in which this is bad. I can't talk to anybody about what's happening to me. And we have enough of that in the culture, right? You don't need to have a sexually addicted family system to have shame about sexuality. But in a sexually addicted family system, there's a lot more at stake and there's a lot more intensity around the contradictory messages and the shame around it. She also talked about subtle and not so subtle, my addition, sexualizing messages. So lots of focus on the body, appearance, sexualizing, inappropriate sexual jokes in these kind of systems, sometimes around body, around gender. Sometimes gender is either elevated or put down. Names are used to describe. So, for example, women might be referred to as whores, right? And if you wear lipstick or something, right? In these systems, there's a crass, hurtful way that sexuality is talked about. Joking can be very, very sexual joking around body parts and so forth can be very embarrassing and shameful and violating to the children. And there may be inappropriate displays of sexuality between the children. There might be inappropriate nudity, touching, massaging, so we start getting some crossing of boundaries. Ultimately, in these systems, children are being conditioned to see themselves in sexual terms. There's an absence of normal modeling of intimate relating. So you might have this sort of sexualizing atmosphere or this distant, but not a lot of sweet, loving affection. Not a lot of safe expression of affection between people. You can get a lot of disengagement and conflict. And basically what happens here is children grow up in these systems devaluing and mistrusting intimacy. And then, of course, we also have the obvious witnessing inappropriate behavior, discovering a parent's porn use, walking in on them, awareness of a parent's affairs, forced to keep secrets, which was part of my story, which is really troubling. And you can read about that in my book. But on one hand, you're aware that one parent's having affairs, they want you to keep it secret, and then you feel like you're betraying the other parent, right? Now you have bookends of trauma there, right? Which was my story, and I know I'm not alone in that. Witnessing objectification of women or men by the parents, exposing a child to prostitution as a sexual, coming out kind of deal. I can't tell you the number of times I've heard that story. It blows my mind. You take them down to the football game, and on the way back, you hire a sex worker for your adolescent son, right? I just want to, unbelievable. But I can't tell you the number of times I've heard that story. So what happens? These kids normalize inappropriate sexual behavior. That's the outcome. There's inappropriate loyalties, using the children by their parents to gain power over each other. So while we're primarily focused on the impact of sex addiction, when the partner or spouse, I'll say this in all due respect and kindness, use the children, they now become also part of the offending agent onto the children. So the adult child book is adult child sensitive. It is looking through the lens of being an adult child. It is not looking through the lens of being a spouse. So you're going to see in my survey data, I got a little survey data for you that's still in progress, but these adult children are not only reporting high percentages of being impacted negatively by their sex addict parent, but also the spouse. So using children to leverage, to dislike, to hate the other parent, or to tell them secrets is very problematic. Obviously, infidelity, known or suspected, is also part of this system. And then the neglect, right? So you've got two parents organized around, one is organized around their addiction, the other may be organized around their own trauma through no fault of her own, for example. But the reality is the children become emotionally neglected around that, and people miss signs. So let's look at that survey data, because I found this interesting. And so this is in progress. I have put together a survey. I'm going to give you some of the information, and this isn't the end point. So on that note, I need about another 20 surveys to get over 100. I got a little over 80. And I'd like to have 100. 100's a little more respectable when you start talking about survey data. And people like to see that the N is 100 or greater. So if any of you are adult children, Alexandra is going to put a link, if she hasn't already, in the chat. The survey will take you 10 minutes. It's just a link. You answer some questions and there's a couple open-ended questions at the end. I'd love to hear your response. So we're looking for adult children of sex addict parents in this survey. Not grandparents, not spousal. You could be both, of course, right? You could be both a spouse and an adult child. Or you could be a sex addict and an adult child of a sex addict. So we're looking for that viewpoint. So we'd love to have your opinion. You can do it anonymously. We have your emails, but we're not gonna be tracking you down. So let's have a look. So of the ones I've looked at so far, and to be continued, of the question I was aware or witnessed, 88% reported that they saw their parents' sexual addictive behavior. 88% struggled with their own sexuality because of their parents' sexually addictive behavior. 82% reported growing up feeling extreme or shameful messages from the family around. So that's a high number. Those are high numbers, right? Not surprising, validating our premise in the book that shame, sexual shame, is the link in the intergenerational trauma. All of them, not surprising because they agreed to take the survey, report negatively impacted, and 84% reported feeling ashamed of their parents' behavior. So notice the topic of shame. Notice the sexual shame here, right? So I'll be curious. This is the percentages after about 56 surveys. So after I get up to 100, we'll see if these numbers change. So you don't want to take these as gospel right yet, but it's heading in the direction we think. So I'm not going to give you all the data, but I want to give you a little. So let's have another look here. Almost 6 out of 10 report feeling caught in a tug of war between their parents. So now we're beginning to see not just the impact of the sexual addiction, but now we're beginning to hear about the impact of the relational and spousal behavior, relational capacity between the parents and the spousal behavior. 62% reported, I was encouraged by my other parent to find fault with or mistrust. So notice they're projecting onto the child the spouse's injury. And it's unfair, right? And I always say this to spouses and partners of sex addict. It is unfair that your kid still loves your sexually addicted spouse. But you know what? You've got to hold the line. So our partner trauma treatment models must begin to rein in any permissiveness to let kids know whatever they want to know, just in the service of the grievance of the spouse. Because now we're getting the voices from the adult children saying, no, that's affected me. You've impacted me by giving me the secrets. I don't want to know. I don't want to hate my father just because you don't like him, right? I want my own anger. So a little over half felt disloyal if they didn't side with the parent. 74% reported they felt like the emotional caretaker of that parent. And almost 8 out of 10 continue to feel like they have to fix their family of origin. So we have another generation of traumatized adults who are carrying the burden of being growing up in a sexually addicted family, bookended by both parents. And I say that in all due respect. So this is just some of the, so at the end of the survey, I asked in the survey, what has been the most impactful moment of growing up in a sexually addicted family? And then what have you done to help yourself? So here's just some the actual voices. The fact that I thought honesty was important. Now I know there were so many secrets. I became an intimacy avoidant, sex and love addict myself. I attracted and sought crazy partners. I didn't know what normal was. There was a lot of anger and silent messages in my home growing up. I had shameful messages about body, sexuality, often name called as a young teenager. Inability to trust anyone. I considered partners disposable or at least upgradable. Look at the objectification coming into the adult child's frame of reference, right? So you can see that if you impose another model on this, IFS, developmental, immature, partner trauma, sex addiction, you're going to miss that person being able to pull out from their story something very critical. No, I'm carrying this because of my sexually addicted parent. So we need the right narrative to open up healing. The biggest impact is the problems it has created in my sexual life and in my marriage. I've had very distant relationships with my dad. I've had multiple sexual partners, found myself in high-risk situations. The other parent, the spouse or partner, took her anger out of me, setting me up to bond with the sexually addicted parent. Notice what this person's saying. You got angry with me. It forced me to declare more loyalty to the person you're angry with. Interesting. So what are some of the characteristics that we see in adult children? These are the 12 that we listed. They have shame about their sexuality, confused about appropriate sexual behavior, and this won't be a surprise to any of you. They're often uncomfortable with their bodies and gender and may go to extremes to compensate, maybe making themselves unattractive or value over attractive, about being overvalued about being attractive. They may be uncomfortable with physical touch or want it all the time. They may be extreme or in their sexual attitudes, either permissive or judgmental. They can be compulsive or avoidant, not surprising, right? And sexualizing experiences not meant to be sexual, or retreating and escaping when it's actually safe and healthy, which is a big complaint from adult children of sex addicts. They often, it's sort of on that note, they sometimes don't really, they're not quite sure what someone's sexual interest means. They may view it as a violation, right? You're going to hurt me like I was once hurt. Or as a sign of love, when neither may be accurate. They miss reading the tea leaves around sexual interest. Somebody's innocent flirting is seen as problematic. Or, again, the declaration of I'm interested in you sexually may be taken as a sign of love when it's not. So they have trouble with that filtering. They may be drawn to overvaluing intensity, risk, drama, sexual excitement in relationships. Again, not surprised by that, right? They unknowingly lack their own value system and boundaries. So you'll hear when I briefly go over recovery, the adult child has to say, they have to divorce the contractual arrangements. We talk about this in the enmeshment work. You have to divorce the contractual arrangements that this value system, I have to change it around. I have to have my own. That becomes critical here. They can be either hypervigilant or unaware of the role of safety, trust, and play. They have trouble playing, so sex has to be ritualized and rigid and so forth. They may overcommit or try to fix those who hurt them sexually or emotionally. They may have difficulty sharing intimately and vulnerably, and they may continue to declare loyalties to their family of origin by allowing themselves to be used by their parents for comfort, to combat their loneliness, to stabilize them emotionally. Not your job to fix that system. So rule number one in recovery is the same thing we do in enmeshment work, is to disengage from that system as my responsibility, which is really hard when leaving it almost always means loss. We'll get to that. The other thing we did in the book is we identified the roles. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because we don't have a lot of time, but we have a workshop that Leilani Sinclair is going to run. You're going to meet her at the end here. One of my associates and also a licensed marriage and family counselor from California. And so she'll take a deeper dive with you should you be interested. So we just like in the adult child literature, some of you remember the hero or the responsible child, the lost child, the scapegoat, and so forth. Similarly, there's a set of role identities that emerge out of these systems that have a uniqueness to them that are different than the adult child of alcoholic literature. So instead of the typical hero or responsible, we have the moral hero or champion, the rabbi, the priest, the pastor, the policeman or woman who says, I have all this shame that I'm going to make sure nobody sees, and I'm going to project out into the world this moral champion. And I'll be the governor of the rules, right? I'll tell you when you've infracted them, even though now I might have a secret life, I'm going to moralize everybody else. So that's specific to this system, different than the other systems of alcoholism and so forth. We have the comforter and caretaker, often the child empathically taking on mom's or dad's pain over being betrayed and trying to fix and repair and absorb. Really, so this is where the enmeshment dynamic begins to intertwine. They become enmeshed and merge with the parents' problems as if they're their own, almost like a betrayal bond, right? They're bonding together out of a mutual trauma. Sort of a version of that, which most of you know I've written about, is the child more specifically who becomes a surrogate spouse. Mommy's lonely. I'll be her lover. I'll be her stable, golden lover who will never leave her. That's a lot of trouble. Or I'll become the sexualized girlfriend of my dad, because the only time I can get any attention is when I'm dressed up and he's talking about my legs or my lipstick, right? Which gets us right into the next one, the seducer and the addict, right? This, or the seductress, this is the person who's identified with the sex addict, who sees, oh, he or she's got the power. So I've learned to get my needs met by sexualizing and seducing others. So again, another role. This is that those couple guys in the group that I talked to who began to cry. They realized that they weren't just sex addicts carrying shame from their behavior. They also were in a role that they took from their family that wasn't theirs to begin with. The truth teller is sort of the version of the scapegoat. The truth teller is the child or the adult in the family who's always pointing out, hey, look at, see what dad's doing over there? Don't be telling. So they're always in your face. And so the truth teller has to learn to sort of moderate how they're going to deal with the family system. So roles can become rigidly fixed. They're organized to protect and fix the system. People mistake them as their own identity, and they require their own specific recovery objectives. What I like in our book, I'm biased, of course, is we give did a whole chapter on general recovery, but each role has a specific set of recovery objectives that you can find in the book. And you also see them in the workshop that we do. So let's talk about the general recovery. We'll have a little time for questions. Send some to the chat if you would. I may be able to open things up, but let's start with the chat. So clearly, the first order of business is to have the right narrative and the right frame. Breaking through denial, telling your story, and being around people and therapists who let you tell your story, and don't quickly say, no, you really need to be talking about your father's alcoholism, or let's use my model of, I love the IFS model, don't get me wrong, I'm not putting that down, but let's go into our IFS work. First things first, you have to tell your story, and it has to be through the right narrative. And then to personalize the recovery objectives so that they work for you. Identifying the major characteristics so you can keep track of them, so you know what they are, and you know that they're not your shame, and to identify those roles and begin to de-role. If your role is always to be the truth teller and the confronter, maybe it's time to back off that. If you're the moral policeman of the world and you can't play sexually with your partner or be comfortable, maybe it's time to back off being the morality police and come into your own body and your own feelings. Clearly, you got to release the shame and give it back to, so we have lots of powerful therapeutic models that help people give back their shame. And not surprising, we have adult children of sex addicts who have their own addictions. And it would be surprising, I don't have numbers for you, be surprising if we don't have high numbers of adult children who have addictions that need to be faced. Ultimately, there's losses. I was talking to a man the other day, and his recovery has saved his life, his marriage, literally saved his life. And the truth is that there's not much left with his family of origin, lots of alcoholism and sex addiction. And there's very limited real estate between him and his parents that he can share anymore. And so his recovery means facing loss of the people I love that I can only visit with them occasionally without getting sucked back in. So be prepared for losses in your recovery. And I'll say we do this work in the enmeshment work. The parents continue to have responsibility. And I said to this man, you know, it's on your parents that they're not available to you. It's not yours. The fact that they won't shift their own identities and their own journey to be able to meet you is producing a loss for both of you. Not surprising, we need to establish new values and rules around sexuality, gender, and body. This is my body. I'm in charge of it. This is what I want sexually. Getting adult children to talk about wanting to, without shame and embarrassment about what to do sexually is very difficult. By all means, if you're single, go slow in dating and courtship. I warn you in advance. Don't be impetuous. Learn to be playful, but stay away from gamesmanship. Make safely bonding as important as genital sexuality. Learn to manage your family interactions differently. So, Dad, if you're going to continue to joke about women in front of me, I'll be leaving the Thanksgiving dinner. I'm not going to be around that anymore. So you've got to have boundaries. You can't be duplicit in yourself anymore. Which doesn't mean you're going to grab your parents by the lapels and shake them and embarrass them publicly. But if the cat's out of the bag and somebody's being inappropriate, it's time that you take care of yourself around that. Or if your mother says, you know what your father did, you say, Mom, I'm not listening anymore to that. That's not my problem. You're going to have to deal with it. I love you. Let me give you a hug. But if you're going to continue, I'm going to have to leave. So you're going to have to rearrange, and we do this work in the enmeshment workshop all the time. And I would end by saying seeking specific therapy and support. So what can we, that's adult child specific. Stay tuned. There'll be some training down the road here later this year for therapists. If your therapist is unwilling to at least read the book, I'd be a little concerned. If they're wedded to their models and they can't see past their models, I'd be a little concerned. And they may be very good models, right? So what can we conclude? Clearly, apparent sex addiction impacts adult children primarily in the areas of trust, intimacy, sexuality, gender, and body image. It's a lot of stuff. Sexual shame is the link. The sex addict's behavior is the primary in the damage, but also the partners play a role in passing on mistrust and other burdens. Recovering sex addicts and their partners need to begin to attend to the healing of their children and their adult children. I think that the amends process, for example, that they talk about in the 12-step program, I think it has to be ongoing. This idea that I'm doing a living amends, I think, is sometimes a cop-out. So if I'm continuing to, I had a son before, after my recovery, so he wasn't impacted by any of my addictions. But you know, there's a few things that slip through the cracks that I see in him, and you know, he's had a few challenges, not a lot, but a few, and I know I've played a role. And every once in a while, if I see him struggling, I'll say, Zach, I'm sorry. I wish I could take it back. And you know, I have a responsibility not to prone myself and to be, you know, submissive or to have excessive guilt, but just to unburden him. You don't need to feel that. That's on me. You know, we finally got to the point now, the last time I saw him with a little piece of me in him that I wish he didn't have, he said, you know, if that's all I got to deal with, I'm pretty lucky. So it took him a while to sort of reconcile this part. So I think addicts have a responsibility to do an ongoing amends, which is different than an ongoing apology or submissiveness. I think partners too need to take some responsibility and get out of the business of using the children as leverage and weaponizing disclosure of secrets. Tough to do, but important to do. So I think these models need to incorporate the adult child of partner stuff. So let me just ask you a few questions myself, and then I'm going to see what questions you might have. So you could jot these down, you can think about them, some reflections for you. So there you have it. I'll spend a few more minutes with you trying to answer some questions if you have them. So are there questions in the chat, Alex, that you see? That kind of
Yeah,
general?
yeah, one of the questions was just kind of some general commentary on addressing the resentment that comes with the role that they got placed into and kind of moving on from that.
Well, like other injuries that we get from our upbringing or trauma stories with our families, clearly, some of those grievances need to be processed in therapy, so that you can then turn to your parent and say, look, I need to talk with you. And here's what I went through. And I need you to know that really was trouble for me, your affairs. So I never advise that you take your rage, to your parent. I think that's not in your best interest. So I think some of that, which doesn't mean you don't have a right to it. It just means that part of the unburdening of your resentment is to get heard. And so if you're going to sit down with your parent, you want to make sure you're going to have one shot, by the way, if you're lucky. You want to deliver it as diplomatically and earnest as you can. When my mother was dying for the 100th time, it was one of her things, right? She always was dying. And I said, that's it. She might die this time. I'm going to go tell her my resentments and my appreciation. So I went to the hospital room and I said, Mom, I want to know if you'll give me permission to tell you my resentments with you and my appreciation. She said yes. And I did. It was a powerful moment. So I think you can have a chat. And I think it's important that I want to use the word confront, but I think it's the wrong word, your parents. But you need to prep for that. And I think if you take your rage there, I don't think it serves anybody.
Another question was if their parent had multiple affairs and kind of spoke about women as objects and everything, but was not actually declared as a sex addict. Is this still applicable for them? Can they still take the survey?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because so first of all, I think some of the stuff we describe in the book relates to anybody who's been in a system where there's been infidelity, whether or not that person meets the criteria for what we would call addiction, which has its own debate. Although I think less so now. The ICD, International Classification Diagnostic System that's used internationally, has compulsive sexual behavior disorder as an official diagnosis. So even if there's not an official diagnosis, you'll relate to it. And in the survey, I give you the option of 1 to 5. 1, definitely sexually addicted. 5, definitely not sexually addicted. 3, neutral. So you have the option to pick on a scale from 1 to 5 where you might feel your parent falls.
And then just one more question was, so tying this into enmeshment, how do you separate the two and how do they impact each other? And is this discussed in the enmeshment workshop, or do you feel that it's a separate situation?
So let's come back to where we started. If you're an adult child of a sex addict, you want to first look at your story through the lens of the adult children view, right? Because then everything opens up. And so those of you who played the role of a surrogate spouse, caretaker, you're the ones who are going to probably carry the enmeshment dynamic. Too much closeness, too much involvement, too much merging. So they're related but separate. So if somebody said to me, I'm an adult child of a sex addict, and I need to get in touch with what that means, and I have these heavy enmeshment issues that I can't unhook from taking care of my mother or father, I would say do some education, some therapy, take the workshop around adult children, and then come in and do some enmeshment work. I'd almost tear it up. First things first, but I would do both.
This is kind of an interesting one. They said, what would you consider red flags for adult children of sex addicts to pay attention to in dating and new relationships?
That's a big one. Going too fast on your part. I think that's, slow it down. Slow it down, pay attention to things that don't feel right, and you're going to have to learn to differentiate. So you were asking about your choices. I'm not going to give you that answer because we could spend all day here. I think you need to learn to differentiate between your projection that may or may not be there and the reality that's there. So the sooner you know your story, the sooner you take care of that part of you that was once burdened and injured, the sooner you'll make good choices. So you don't want to let that little girl or that little boy or that adolescent do the choosing. Because if you're impetuous or compulsive, you'll merge together these parts, and your wise adult may not do the choosing. That's my best advice. I'm going to turn this over to Alex and Leilani. Where are you, Leilani? There you are. So Leilani, Alex is going to briefly mention how to look at so we're doing an educational workshop, and Leilani will talk briefly about it, and I will see some of you another time, and others of you I won't. And thank you, everybody. Nice to see you. Take care.
Thanks, Dr. Adams.
All right. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you, Ken. Welcome, everyone. My name is Leilani Sinclair. I'm a certified sex addiction therapist as well as licensed marriage and family therapist. I'm in my office in Los Angeles. I practice in California as well as Michigan as a clinical associate with Dr. Adams in his practice. Let's see, I primarily work with addicts, partners, as well as adult children of sex addicts and individuals seeking support for enmeshment. I also do a lot of work with young adults as well as members of the LGBTQ plus community. I hope that you'll join me for the 3-series workshop. We're going to be starting it off on March 11th. So it'll be March 11th, 25th, as well as April 8th. Each will last for 2 hours. Dr. Adams is going to be joining us for the workshop, giving a brief overview and introduction. And then really, as we've been talking about today, and as Dr. Adams emphasized, we're going to be doing a lot of education about what it means to identify as an adult child, the distinct roles and role identities that children in a sexually addicted system adopt. And then we'll be doing work on developing our own personal narratives and really how to tell our own stories as adult children. Really the purpose of that too is also so it can serve as a roadmap for healing going forward. Again, telling the story is, given the secrecy and deep-rooted nature of the shame that is really specific to adult children of sexually addicted parents, that process can take some time, and we want to give it the time that it needs to recover the memories that are kind of key to each of our stories. So we'll be doing that, introducing tools and strategies to release the burden of secrecy, unwanted shame, and confusion that is part of this covert dynamic within the system. And then in the last workshop, we'll be dedicating time to creating an individualized self-care plan that addresses specifically the roles each adult child kind of gravitates toward that were mentioned, as well as the aligning recovery objectives. And then ultimately next steps in terms of reinforcing each own's work in reinforcing and developing stronger, healthy, fulfilling relationships, body image, empowered self-esteem, healthy trust and boundaries, intimacy, and sexuality. So that's a lot to cover, which is why we've broken it down into 3 2-hour sessions. That's it.
Thanks, everybody, and we will see you at our next webinar.